Hi and welcome to Midnight Cry, a program that is committed to speaking the truth in love. I'm your host, Ramul Hussain, and today we have with us Beth Grove, who will be discussing with us what Islam actually is. First of all, welcome to the show, Beth.
Thank you.
Now, you've heard the topic. This is what we're going to be talking about. Now, Islam really is a religion which encompasses the world. In as far as I know, it has reached the four corners of the earth. Now, it might not be a majority in every country, but certainly most people have heard about it. Now, it's only second to Christianity. And I'm being told that it has up to 1.6 billion adherents. So there are so many, yet there are so many people who know next to nothing about this religion. So can you please, through your experience and through your knowledge, can you please define for us what Islam actually is?
Well, a non-Muslim would probably define it slightly different from a Muslim. But when I've spoken to my Muslim friends, most of them say simply that it means submission. And it means submission to Allah and His Messenger. There's a surah in the Quran that sums up very well. And I'll read that to you now. And it's in Surah chapter 5, ayah 111. It says this, "And when Allah, inspired the believers or the disciples to believe in me and my messenger, they said, 'We believe and bear witness that we are Muslims.'" And that really sums it up, simply what Islam is or what Islam means.
So then, Beth, my next question would be submission to what? What is it that we're supposed to be submitting to?
That's a huge topic, but we submit to Allah, the Quranic concept of God, and that's very different to the biblical concept of God. And we submit to Muhammad. Again, there's nothing to do with the other prophets. It's specifically to Allah and Muhammad.
Now, Islam initiated, according to the Christian belief, some 14 centuries ago. But if you ask a Muslim, they'll say, no, it's always been around. But however, even if we looked at it in context, historically speaking, it started 14 centuries ago by an Arabian male who declared fundamentally two things: that there was one God and that this person was his messenger that was sent. But I want to ask you, why is it that Islam spread so fast?
Well, a lot of Muslims will say it spread through conversions, it spread through a spiritual awakening, etc.
Was it a supernatural act of God?
I believe it wasn't at all. And in fact, if you look at history, not just external history books outside of Islam, but within Islam, if you read the text of Islam, the biography of Muhammad, if you read the hadith, which is the sayings of Muhammad, the traditions, you'll find that even from within the traditions of Islam, that Islam spread very quickly within a 1 or 2 centuries. And it spread through the sword. It was through conquest. And they spread all the way over through to Spain by the end of the 7th century. And they spread all the way over through to India. And they've never actually given any of that land back. And it was...
But there were some conversions that were a matter of the will, they freely chose?
There would have been some, of course, but you found that there was a lot of pressure to convert in some places. For example, there were a couple of taxes that were put under on people who were non-Muslims, and the word in Arabic is zimmi. And people who were under Islam, those who were non-Muslims, had to pay much higher taxes than the Muslims. So you have a jizya tax, you have a kharaj tax. These are land taxes, etc., that people had to give, and they were higher than your Muslims. And if you're very poor person, you would often convert just so you could actually survive.
So that was a type of prompt that would encourage people to convert.
Certainly.
So they didn't have to pay this higher tax.
Yes, and we know that Muhammad exemplified this in his own life. For example, this sort of pressure, not necessarily the taxes, but the pressure. For example, one of his wives, Safiya, was taken as a slave. And it says in the traditions in Sahih Bukhari, volume 5, it says that her manumission, which means her freedom from slavery, was her bridal price. So her mat was her bridal price.
Yes.
Was her manumission, was what set her free.
Yes. Now, can we perhaps define Islam to a certain set of rules? I mean, is there basic tenets to Islam? Is there pillars of Islam?
Yeah, there's 5 pillars of Islam. A lot of people know some of these. A lot of people know about, for example, the fasting. But there's actually 5, and it's not just the 5 pillars. But the first pillar is called the Shahada, which is the statement of faith, and that's where you proclaim that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is His prophet. The next one is Salat, which is prayer, and you have to pray 5 times a day. And then you have Swam, which is what we know as Ramadan, and that would be the 1-month fast. Then you have Zakat, which is the tithing or the giving, which is 2.5%, and all Muslims must do this. And then you have the Hajj, which is when they go to Mecca, and once in a lifetime Muslims must try get to Mecca and go to the holy city. And those would be the 5 pillars. But then a lot of converts that I've spoken to, and many Muslims, if you read Muslim books, they'll talk about a concept called deen, and this is sort of the practical outworking of their faith. And a lot of Muslims don't actually understand what this word means either. And if you actually Google it, if you go online, you'll find Muslims asking, what does deen mean? And it's quite interesting. And you'll find converts will talk about their deen, their practice of Islam. And then you have the 6 beliefs, and this is a little bit different. For example, you have the belief in God, and again, it's Allah, very different from the biblical God. You have the prophets, 24 of them, or a number of them would be from the Bible. So it would be Ibrahim, we'd say Abraham, David or Dawood, etc. Musa, we'd say Moses in English. There's different prophets like that. Then you have the whole concept of angels. Angels is and jinn, which is, they could be, jinn can be good or bad, and in English, in Christianity, we talk about them as demons, probably. You have the holy books, the Injil, which we say the New Testament, the Torah, which is the Old Testament, or part of the Old Testament, the Zabur, which is the Psalms, and then you have the Quran, which they say is the final revelation. You've got judgment, and Muhammad talks about judgment all the time. Judgment is a really big point of his message. He seems to be very concerned about judgment and Judgment Day. And then you have predestination, or the decrees of God. So there's also those 6 beliefs, core beliefs that all Muslims need to adhere to.
Yes. And so, I mean, when we think about these things, as we do think about any religion, we always ask the question, is there assurance in the things that I do? Will they somehow avert my judgment so that I enter into paradise, heaven, or whatever the case might be? So is there assurance? Is there absolute assurance in Islam?
No, there isn't. And I've never been able to have, when I've asked a Muslim has never said to me, yes, I am going to heaven, yes, I'm going to paradise. They cannot say that. It would be audacious of them to say that. Because in the Quran, it says that Allah judges who He wills and He forgives who He wills. And so it's quite an arbitrary form of justice. And there's this idea in Muslim writing where if when you come to the end time, you're going to cross the Sirat bridge, and as you cross this razor-sharp bridge, which is called the Sirat bridge, Allah can throw you down into hell if He wants to. And so I don't know if you've ever seen a Muslim funeral. I've always been very, very struck by the grief that I see at Muslim funerals. And I think the grief is so deep because they don't know where their loved one has gone. And yet, for those of us who are Christians, if you watch a Christian funeral, of course there's grief. Grief is a God-given way to deal with pain and loss. But there's not so much grief because we have hope, and we know that this Christian person is in heaven with God. And so we have assurance, but Muslims don't have assurance. There is a verse in the Quran that says that if you die in the cause of Allah, and that's in Surah 47 verse 6, if you die in the cause of Allah, then you gain access into the gardens of paradise. But again, that's most people will not have that. But in Christianity, it's not through that. It's through knowing God Himself, and that is the Lord Jesus Christ. We have full assurance to gain access into heaven.
That's right. And it's so important that people do understand that. And I would urge any of our viewers who are actually watching this episode is that there was even a particular time, a specific time where we read in the Gospel of John in chapter 6, and there Jesus was telling the disciples, and in fact He was telling anybody and everybody, but in particular He was talking to His disciples, and He was saying to them, don't run after the food that perishes. Don't go after the things that are temporary, those things that only satisfy for the time being, but go after those things which are eternal. And so his disciples, when they had listened to him, obviously they were quite eager, and they were taught to follow the law. And the law of Moses emphasized doing. The law basically said, as we both know, if you do this, then God is happy. If you do this, God is happy. But the law really was to show that we're sinners, that we fail. It wasn't to somehow impress God. And so the disciples asked Jesus, and they said to him, tell us, what works should we do in order to be able to do the work of God? So how can we enter heaven? What work can we do in order to receive salvation? And we read in John chapter 6, and I believe it's in verses 28 and 29, Jesus says to them that the work of God is this, to believe in the one whom God has sent.
Absolutely.
And so the work that we need to do, if there is a work, is to place our faith in Him. And I think as you're telling me about Islam, I'm able to see that really it is a complex system of works. Would that be an accurate description of Islam?
It becomes very complex because the Quran says that what Allah and His apostle, or what Allah and Muhammad have decreed, you must obey. And of course, once you start moving beyond the pillars, once you start moving beyond the beliefs, you have to find a way to practically apply all these rules and all these regulations. And these rules and regulations were made in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, many, many centuries ago. And so, of course, we live in a different century with different issues. And so trying to apply laws and regulations from 1400 years ago to the 21st century becomes very complex.
Yes.
And that's why they have the whole idea of interpretation, and they have the ulema and imams have to make fatwas, etc., to try make it applicable for today. And again, if you Google online and you find out, going to Muslim chat rooms, they're always asking, so how do I deal with this situation? What does the Sharia law say about that situation? Because they don't know how to apply their religion, because it is all about rules and regulations, and you must obey Muhammad and you must obey Allah, and it becomes very complex. My Muslim friends say to me, Betty, our religion is so complex, and I say, just trust in Jesus.
Yes.
It becomes so much easier.
Yes.
And not that we don't have rules. We
Yes.
do. We have a moral law.
That's
we have an
right.
obligation to be holy, but it's not these rules and regulations from 2,000 years ago, because Jesus is the law now. We follow Jesus, and when we follow Jesus, that is our law, and we know how to live today because He prompts us and He guides us. So it's very different from Islam.
That's right. And I mean, these rules don't save us. They're simply an evidence, and they're a fruit of the faith that we have in God. God expects us to do these things because of the grace that He has given us. And I think so often people misunderstand what grace is. And the Apostle Paul explained it quite well, and it's a verse that we know quite well, that, that we have been saved by grace through faith. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any person should boast. And so grace is really the merit of God. It is the salvation of God, which God gives to all people freely, but we need to receive it. And how do we receive it? We receive it through faith. But what you're saying here to me is that faith in Allah, faith in the Muslim God, is not sufficient in itself to save you. Yes, you must have faith, but you need to also do these pillars of Islam. Is that right?
Well, it really is, do your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. And you have angels recording your bad deeds, and you have angels recording your good deeds, and will your deeds outweigh your bad deeds. And I had a Muslim friend from North Africa who, as a young 10-year-old boy, was raised as a Muslim, because it's a very Muslim country that he came from. And he actually was converted through this point, because he said, what if my good and bad deeds are exactly the same? What happens then? And he says, Islam has no answer for that. Will Allah forgive me? Will He not forgive me? And so he actually began to think, there's something wrong here, and he began to think that through. And so for Muslims, when they die, I can't imagine what it's like to face death, knowing on your deathbed, not knowing if your good deeds are going to outweigh your bad deeds. That must be a petrifying thought. And because in Christianity it doesn't depend on me, it's audacious of me as a human being to believe that I could ever be good enough for the presence of God. It's audacious for any of us to believe that. But actually the fact that God took the sin on his shoulders and he took the punishment instead of me, that's why I can now enter the presence of God, because it's based on God's work, not based on my work. And that's a huge difference. When I die on my deathbed, I know straight where I'm going straight away, and it's a wonderful thought.
So would you say that a lot of Muslims have insecurity in terms of their eternity, where they're going?
Yes, and I certainly have asked my friends, why are you following a religion when you're not sure where you're going? And I remember talking to a young woman. She was an English convert to Islam, very young woman. And I asked her, I said, do you know what's going to happen to you after death, especially as a woman? And she goes, oh, I've just converted. I'm just beginning to learn my religion. And I said to her, why have you converted when the reason we even follow a religion on this earth is for the afterlife? And yet you don't know what's going to happen to you in the afterlife when you die. And she didn't have an answer for that.
Yes, and it's so important. I mean, once you step off into eternity, you can't simply say, look, I'm sorry, God, let me go back and make amends and do what is necessary. I think we can say that both Muslims and Christians understand that once you make a decision here, this is your testing ground, and there's no reverse gear. You can't simply just go back and say, give me a second chance. That's it. So really, you don't want to take a gamble with your own soul. You want to know, you want to step out assured, knowing where you're going to go. Now, I want to look at a different aspect also, and that is that we can tell a lot about a religion by the way it treats its people, especially when it is the dominant religion in that place or in that setting, especially when it comes to treating women. And now I know that this is a subject that is very close to your heart. And I don't know how else to put it, but I'm going to ask it very clearly. Do you believe that Islam ennobles women?
The very simple answer is no, I don't. And there's a reason for that. I've done a lot of study.
But there would be a lot of Muslim women that would argue and they would say no.
In fact, the big claim from many Muslim scholars is that Islam and Muhammad ennobled women. That is the claim. And you read it in every book that you find that comes from that's an Islamic book. You read it in all the da'wah material that's given out. Every leaflet that I'm given is about how Islam ennobled women. And I'm going to talk a lot about that in other programs. But simply put, Islam does not actually ennoble women. That's not my opinion. Even if you look at the Quran and just take the Quran at face value, you'll see how it doesn't. I'll just give you a few verses. For example, let's say Surah 4:3, where it talks about that a man can have up to 4 wives. Now, a lot of Muslim women, some Muslim women, not a lot, but some Muslim women think that's okay. I know Muslim women who are in polygamous marriages. But what I would say is that if Islam ennobled women, first of all, why didn't it bring it down just to one husband, so the woman is loved by the one man, which most women want? Look at all the movies around the world. Look at Bollywood. Look at all the Urdu movies. It's all about love between a man and a woman. That is deep inside a woman's heart. So why didn't Islam do that? If it truly wanted to ennoble women, give that woman one man to love her. Every woman knows that they want love from one man, and they don't want his love to be divided among other women. And so if Islam wanted to ennoble women, then Islam would have made it that woman would have got just his love, and he wouldn't have loved anyone else. But also, why can't she have 4 husbands? Now, I don't support having 4 husbands, nor do I support having 4 wives. But the fact is, there needs to be parity.
A balance,
balance and equality there. We know before Islam came that women did have more than one husband. Now, I don't support that as a Christian, but there does need to be equality there. There's other verses where in Surah 4 verse 11, women get half the inheritance. Now that might have made sense in 6th century Arabia or 7th century Arabia. It doesn't make sense today, especially in the West where I live, where we women are in charge of our finances. It made sense back in Muhammad's day when the men were in charge of the finances, and Islam makes that happen where men are in charge of the finances, but not today. Also, a woman's testimony is a witness in court, and that's in Surah 2, Ayah 282, where a woman's testimony is half that of a man in court, and that still is in the Sharia today. And that happens around the Muslim world, where it has to have 2 women and then 1 man. And it's interesting because Muhammad actually says it's so, and the Quran says is that so one woman can remind the other woman, so because they're more forgetful. The Quran doesn't say that because they're more forgetful, but it's the idea that the Quran seems to think that women are more forgetful. And so just a few simple verses like that. There are many more which we'll look at in further programs, but it just shows how the God of the Quran seems to have a very, I would suggest, not an ennobling view of womanhood.
And it's so important because we understand that if the Quran truly is, the final revelation of God, then it really should back up and it should be in support to the original scriptures that were given. And we know from the very beginning is that God made one man for one woman. And straight away we can see equality there. And even in the making of the man and the woman, God says that He has made them in His image.
That's an amazing, amazing key point of Christianity. And it's in the first chapter of the Bible. And it sets down the foundation of theology for the rest of the Bible. That God says in Genesis 1, let us make man in our image, male and female, let's make them in our image. And that just shows there is something extremely ennobling for both men and women, not just women, both men and women. There's no verse like that in the Quran.
Yes, that's right. So then I'd like to ask you, what would your challenge be? Perhaps to a Muslim or maybe even to a woman who is considering to become a Muslim convert. How would you challenge her? What would you say to her?
There's a lot of verses in the Quran, I'll just say 2 very quickly right now, that as a woman I have immense problems with. For example, in Surah 4:34 it says men are in charge of women. In Surah 2, Ayah 2-8 it says that men have a degree of them over them. Now, lots of Muslim scholars try to explain that away in different ways. But actually, when you look at the Arabic and you look at what the Quran says, this theme comes over and over and over again. And if you contrast that to the Bible, and when we look at what the Bible teaching is on men and women, there's no concept of this men being above or men being in charge at all of women. There's equality in essence, which we just discussed in Genesis chapter 1. There's equality in marriage. We'll look at that at another time. Equality in witness, in testimony, in the way which we're to be treated. And as we were talking earlier, the whole idea of husbands love your wife as Christ loved the church. That means a husband is to serve and sacrifice himself for his wife. There is no concept of that in the Quran. The nearest the Quran gets to a husband loving his wife is be kind to your wife. There's a loving kindness, but it's a kindness, get close to your wife. It's not sacrificial love.
So there are some nice things which are said, but do you find that the information that is being given to you, which is from Islamic sources, is generally cherry picking?
I do, and I actually, many of my Muslim friends will make claims, and I often want to say, you cannot have read the Quran if you're making this claim. New translations of the Quran actually saying husbands to love their wives, that's not in the Arabic. And so I often want to say to them, go read the Quran in your language. And I encourage any Muslim watching this program, read the Quran in your language, understand what it says. It's not enough just to hear the cadence or hear the sound of it in Arabic. Read it in your language, understand it in your language, and then read the Injil, read the New Testament, get your hands on the New Testament, and compare what God says for women there, compare what God says for women in the Quran, and you'll see they're absolutely opposed to one another.
Yes, yes. Beth, thank you for your time. I mean, what I can see here is that we've really been able to taste and see the different things that we can find in the Bible and in the Quran. So please stay in tune with us for the very next episode as we continue to discuss these important subjects in Islam. What we would like to look at next is that why is it that there are Western women who are being attracted to Islam? there are a number of cases that we would like to go through. So please stay with us as we do discuss this very important subject. May God